Hey there, welcome to the channel. So I know I have a hoodie on and I've got a beanie hat on underneath. More on that later, but let's talk about today's recipe. Today I am taking a subscriber submitted recipe and we are converting it over to gluten-free. We're making a gluten-free apple dapple cake. I've made some changes to the recipe. I've made some adaptations to the recipe. Now let's see if it's any good. I'm Jamie with SavorySaver. I share gluten-free recipes, tips, tricks, and resources to make your gluten-free lifestyle easier. So please consider hitting subscribe. Let's go through the process and give it a try together. So before we jump into the recipe and any recipe notes, let's talk about my hoodie issue. Over Thanksgiving weekend, I was out of town. Tara stayed in town because she's in healthcare and had to work on Friday. I was at my mom's and we were talking and she said the heating unit was not working properly. I thought I did something wrong with the programming. I thought I hit a button, and we don't program, we just adjust up and down where we need it. Came home over the weekend, thought I'd figured it out. It wasn't me or Tara, it was the unit not working. Someone came out and we need to have it replaced. So they are coming Monday. I am filming this on Friday. So we've been without heat for a week. Thankfully, it hasn't been super cold the whole week. We have a couple days we're in the 40s. We don't deal well with 40s here in the South. Too cold for us. We do have gas logs, so we've been using those. It's been chilly in the house. 53 a couple mornings inside the house. Gas logs have been running. This is a good opportunity for me to use the oven and put some extra heat into the house. So it's been a little chilly here, but we're surviving it. We're making it work. A few more days and we should have central heat again. Now, the recipe. One of my longtime viewers and subscribers, Brenda, she and I go back and forth in the comments on a regular basis. We also email a little bit back and forth. So she sent me her family's recipe for apple dapple cake. Now, it is not gluten-free, and her family has made a few changes over the years, and it's a family recipe, so directions aren't always clear and concise like a cookbook. But I think it's an easy enough recipe to do. We're going to convert. Brenda had a suggestion in her email to me. I'm going to use part of that suggestion. I'm going to cut the recipe because Brenda and I have talked that sometimes recipes make a lot. And so I'm going to go really off the chain. I'm doing converting the recipe. I'm cutting the recipe in half. I'm changing the way it's baked, and we're going to see if I get screwed. Can I say that on this channel? It's my channel, but can I say that? I don't know. We might leave that in there. We'll see. So as we go through the recipe, I'm going to try to make some conversation in there about what I've changed, why I've changed. A lot of the recipe I'm just going to cut in half. And there's a little bit that I will cut back some, but not necessarily in half, just because it shouldn't affect our bake. So as I go through this, when you see errors or you see improvements, drop it in the comments below. And Brenda, we are going to see if A, I do it justice, B, if I make it successfully, and C, if you guys need to send me some recipes too, or if I'm just gonna mess this up across the board. Let's get started. So I'm using about 3 different recipes for this apple dapple cake. I'm using Brenda's recipe that she sent me with a couple changes, of course. I'm using the gluten-free apple cake recipe from Mama Knows Gluten-Free because it was basically the same recipe mostly. Just wasn't called the same thing. And I'm using another one that I saw, and because instead of making this as a bundt cake, I'm actually gonna make it in an 8x8 pan. And I'm using that idea from a website where I saw they basically baked this cake, but in a 13x9. So we're actually taking it down to an 8x8. So if you don't have a bundt pan at home, this might be a good option if it comes out. So in the description below, I will give you recipe ingredients. I'm gonna link you to Mama Knows Gluten-Free. I will put down any ingredients you may not have. And I may put some notes in there because I'm kind of making my own recipe out of this. So with the recipe that was sent to me, of course it used all-purpose flour, which we can't use. Mama Knows Gluten-Free uses a gluten-free 1-to-1 measure flour. She likes Pillsbury. I will say there's not many gluten-free flours I've tried that I just don't like. I don't like that one. I think it's gritty. I can't find it on a regular basis. I really just don't like that flour. It may work for her and that's great. and, you know, use what works for you, but I'm not using that. I'm using Bob's Red Mill for this one. It's a 1-to-1. If you have cup for cup, if you have King Arthur measure for measure, I would use one of those in place of whatever. Just make sure it has the xanthan gum in it. If it doesn't have xanthan gum, maybe with this recipe, maybe half a teaspoon of xanthan, quarter teaspoon, somewhere in there, maybe. So I've got 1.5 cups of the gluten-free flour in this bowl, and I've taken out about a tablespoon, and I'll tell you why in just a minute. To that, I'm going to add half a teaspoon of baking powder. Baking powder gets its leavening from the heat of the oven, so that'll help give the cake some lift. I'm also going to add a quarter teaspoon of baking soda. So for that leavening, we actually are going to need an acidic ingredient, which will come in just a second. Brenda's recipe had salt. Mama Knows Gluten-Free did not. I'm going to add salt into the recipe. Brenda's recipe for the full bundt cake was a teaspoon of salt. I've got a half a teaspoon here. So for the final dry ingredient, I'm going to add cinnamon. And the original recipe that I was sent had a quarter teaspoon for a whole bundt cake. And the gluten-free version that I found used a tablespoon in a bundt cake. So I'm going in the middle a little bit more. I'm going to use a teaspoon. If you like more cinnamon, use more. If you like less, use less. This should not affect your bake other than in the taste. If you have apple pie spice, use that instead. Pumpkin pie spice, try that. It's just a warming spice, so use what you have available. Brenda's recipe is an old-fashioned recipe which usually says sift. Gluten-Free Mama's does not. I'm going to whisk this, which is going to give us a little bit of that sifting. It's going to mix everything up. It's going to lighten the flours and blend everything together. All right, dry ingredients mixed. Let's move on to our wet. All right, I've got a large bowl because I'm going to add the dry to the wet. So I've got 1 cup of sugar. Brenda, this is a nod to your suggestion. Mama Knows Gluten-Free used butter. Brenda's recipe used oil, and Brenda says she felt that it could be cut back a little bit. She also suggested applesauce. Since Mama Knows Gluten-Free used a cup of butter, I'm using half a cup of my oil. So I've got 1/4 cup of vegetable oil. This is actually canola. Use what you feel is best. And I'm going to add 1/4 cup of applesauce. Applesauce a lot of times can be a 1-for-1 swap. So if you want to try all applesauce, do that. If you want to try all oil, do that. We're going to try half and half. Now, Mama Knows Gluten-Free uses a mixer. The other recipe doesn't say mixer, and it's an old recipe, which means they're probably doing it by hand. Think of this as like a quick bread kind of cake. We don't need no stinking mixer. Let's just cream this together. All right, I'm going to put that to the side. I'm going to turn on my oven to start preheating. I'm going to preheat it to 325 degrees. That was a consistent temperature that I saw on all the recipes I looked at. So I'm going to bump that on now. Also greased an 8x8 pan. I think you could go 9x9 too, guys. I wouldn't worry about that 1-inch difference. I think it's still going to bake fine. I use shortening. Use whatever grease you prefer. I like shortening and stuff like this. I don't like the sprays. I feel a shortening gives better coverage, but use what you want. It's important to hit record when you're filming. This here is a buttermilk substitute. I needed half a cup of buttermilk, and Mama Knows Gluten-Free uses buttermilk, and Brenda's recipe did not, but it had more oil in it. So I've gone with the buttermilk option. So I took 1.5 teaspoons of white vinegar and put it into my measuring cup, and then added regular whole milk up to the half cup mark. Let it sit for 5 or 10 minutes, and then you have a good homemade buttermilk substitute. So I've added that. I'm also going to add vanilla. So I'm basically cutting this in half. The recipe I was sent had 2 teaspoons, and the blog recipe I found has a tablespoon. So I'm going to go with a teaspoon and a half or a half tablespoon. Okay, let's whisk it combined and then put it off to the side. All right, everything's pretty much uniform in color. I'm going to put it to the side. Let's talk apples. We're gonna use 1.5 cups of peeled and chopped apples. I have Fuji. Some recipes said Granny Smith. Use the apple that you like best. Anything firm like Granny Smith, Fuji, Honeycrisp, something firm, but get the flavor profile that you like. If you don't like the tartness of a Granny Smith, then get a sweeter apple. You just don't want to use something like a Macintosh that is going to be mushy. You want something that's going to keep its shape. I've already peeled them. I'm just going to chop them. You want about 1.5 cups, so I'm going to go with 3. I think that'll be fine. Okay, so my apples are cut up, and I also have 1/2 cup of chopped pecans. If you don't want to use nuts, leave them out. If you don't have pecans and have walnuts, use those instead. 1/2 cup of those. I'm adding it to the apples. I'm not. I'm adding the apples to the pecans. And then I'm going to take that tablespoon of gluten-free flour and I'm just going to put it over the apples and the pecans just to try to coat them a little bit. And hopefully that will help everything suspend a little bit more in the cake without affecting the way the cake bakes in regards to not having that little bit of flour directly in the mix. Okay, back to our liquid. Give it another stir just to bring anything up from the bottom. Some of that sugar still hasn't dissolved. Now I'm going to add in my dry. And I think I'm just going to switch to the spatula now and give it a good stir. Now, Mama Knows Gluten-Free says this is going to be a thick batter. Let's see what it does because I've made a bunch of changes. And honestly, it's more changes that you should really make on a recipe at a time. They usually say 1 change, maybe 2, depending on what it is, and I changed like 10. Okay, so batter-wise, I feel that this is a cake batter. I don't feel that it's not. It does have some lumps in it, and that's because I've hand mixed. So if you want, you can go back in with your whisk and whisk it a little more, or you could use a hand mixer if you really wanted to. Let's add in my apples and pecans. Get everything mixed in. This is going to thicken up the batter just a little bit more. And then once everything's mixed, you're good. All right, let's see if I've got a big enough pan. All right, everything fit in there perfect. I'm very excited about that. It looks like a cake batter. Lots of apples and nuts in here. Now we need to bake this off. A bundt cake is about 1 hour to 1 hour and 15-minute bake, typically. 13 by 9, the recipe I looked at was about 45 minutes, I think. This, I'm going to go the 45 minutes. I will probably check it a half hour in or so just to look at it. Maybe even wait until the 40-minute mark. I think it's going to take a while to bake. It is pretty thick and we need to cook it all the way through. Key things to remember. It's a cake. Cakes bake until a toothpick comes out clean. So, you might have to adjust a little bit time-wise depending on your oven. Once it's done, we're going to put a topping over it, and normally it would be a glaze across the bundt. Kind of going to do the same thing here, but instead of it being a glaze, it's going to end up just being all over it instead of running down the sides. Let's get this baked, and while that bakes, we will make up the glaze. So you guys didn't see this, but while I was mixing, I actually took my hood off and was fine. I'm cold again. Our cake is just about done. I just checked it at the 40-minute mark. It's starting to get golden brown around the edges, but the center is not cooked. So I set it for another 5 minutes. We'll see if it's done at that point. Now I want to start the glaze for it just so it's ready to go. We'll actually cook it when I finally take that out. But for now, let's just get the ingredients ready. We're only going to need enough glaze to put over the top of the cake, so I don't want a ton of it. I've basically taken the recipe that I found for the 13 by 9 and kind of cut it in half and just tweaked the amounts a little bit just because I want to see what it does. So I'm going to start with butter. I want about 1.5 tablespoons, and I'm going to eyeball it. This is salted, and certainly use unsalted if that's what you have. I'm using the salted just because I think it'll balance out the sweetness a little bit, and I don't think it's going to matter in the end overall. To the butter, I'm gonna add a little bit of milk. The recipe actually called for heavy cream, which I don't have, and I don't have any half and half open. So I'm gonna use a tablespoon of milk, and I may add a splash more if I need it. And part of the reason I've cut the milk back, because the original recipe was 3 tablespoons. I was gonna do a tablespoon and a half, and then I decided to cut it back more. More on that in just a second. The recipe I used for the glaze called for 3 tablespoons of granulated and 3 tablespoons of brown sugar. I'm gonna eliminate the granulated altogether, and I'm gonna add 3 tablespoons of brown sugar. Brown sugar is gonna have more flavor because of that molasses in there, so let's use the flavor instead of the not flavored granulated. Some of the recipes had cinnamon, some did not. I'm gonna add a little bit of cinnamon just to carry over that cinnamon flavor from the cake. So I'm gonna add just 1/8 teaspoon. The recipe Brenda sent me did not have vanilla in it. Mama Knows Gluten-Free, as well as the 13x9 recipe I looked at, both had vanilla in it. So I'm actually gonna add a full teaspoon of vanilla. If I get to mixing that up and it looks like it needs a little more moisture, I'll add just a splash of milk to take care of that. So we are at the 55-minute mark, and it's nice and golden around the edges, but I am still getting a little bit of wet dough in the center area. And I'm gonna say it's probably the batter and not necessarily the apples in that. So to be on the safe side, I'm gonna go another 5 to 10 minutes, which puts us about an hour to an hour and 5 minutes, maybe even 10 minutes. But I don't want it to brown anymore. So I'm gonna cover this with foil to stop the browning. It'll also insulate a little bit on the top, so maybe it'll cook a little faster. So let me cover it, and I'm gonna do 5-minute increments until it's where I think it needs to be. An hour and 5 minutes. I have just taken it out of the oven. We're gonna see how it is. Let's make the glaze and get that put on. So everything's in a saucepan. I've got it on medium low, so I've got it on about 3, if your numbers go 1 to 9. I'm just gonna whisk everything until the sugar's dissolved. I'm not gonna let it boil. And then once it's all melted, we're just gonna pour it over the hot cake. Mama Knows Gluten-Free says to pour it over the bundt cake after you put some holes in the cake. So I like that idea, and since I've been putting toothpick holes in the cake for the past 20 minutes, there should be plenty of holes in there for this to soak down into. The other recipes did not say to do that, which is okay too. This does look like enough glaze for me, so I'm not gonna do anything else with it. Simply Mama says to not let it boil. The other ones do not say that, so I'm just gonna go until I start seeing bubbles, and then I'm gonna call it good. All right, I've got bubbles starting at the bottom. I'm gonna turn it off. Let's pour it over the cake. All right, I'm just gonna tilt it a little bit to see if anything goes anywhere else. This should take care of the problem of me thinking the cake was cooked or not at all, because I've just poured another 1/4 cup of liquid over it. I'm gonna let it cool for just a little bit, probably not completely. I think this is gonna be really good warm. So let me let it cool for just a few. I'll get a slice out, I'll get a couple photos, and we'll give it a try. Okay, cake is done. It's cooled for about a half hour, I think, maybe a little bit longer, not much. And it's done, it's cut, I did photos. Let's try and talk about it. So there it is, and as far as I can tell, it is cooked all the way through. So it did go an hour and 5 minutes in my oven, covering it the last 10, because I didn't want it to get any darker. It looks like it's pretty moist. The apples look like they rose to the top, so we'll see how that goes once I get into it. And then I also have, it's hard to see in the camera, but that goes to pretty far into the cake, and it still looks like it's cooked. So I think we're cooked through, or baked through, whatever you want to call it. I think we're okay on that. The glaze looks nice, not as nice as the other recipes I looked at. Like the other glazes were light and looked more like a glaze. This has kind of blended with the apple cake, and I'm okay with that. Let's give it a taste, because I think that's going to be the deciding factor on how I did. So the texture of that cake is really good. It is pretty dense, but I figured it would be anyway, because in looking at the regular bundt cake version, it looked like it's a dense cake. The nuts give it some really good flavor. The apples cooked very, very well. They're not mushy. They have just the littlest amount of bite to them. But they have a really good flavor in the cake. I'm not, this is a big thing for me. I'm not tasting that it's gluten-free. This is really good. I don't see that the cake is undercooked. Okay, I've plowed through half the cake. Let me come up for air and we'll talk about it. Now I feel like I have pecan stuck in my teeth. All right, so let's talk recipe converting with this one. I started out with Brenda's recipe. Thank you again, Brenda. Started out with that recipe, which was not gluten-free. Then what I did is I went to Google and Googled gluten-free apple dapple cake. And Brenda, if I remember correctly, you also did that after you and I emailed. Mama Knows Gluten-Free has an apple cake very similar to apple dapple cake. It just didn't have dapple in the name. It's an older recipe, so sometimes older recipes have words we don't use in current recipes or vice versa, so that makes sense. In converting it over, Brenda and I often go back and forth about recipes making a lot. Sometimes you don't want a lot. Sometimes converting a recipe you definitely don't want a lot because you don't want it to turn out horrible and throw it away. So I brought it down to an 8x8, which is still a pretty good size recipe, and I put it in the 8x8, not a bundt pan. After cutting it down to an 8x8 and not having any real issues, I do think a full-size recipe would work really well. I also think that if you were using the straight Mama Knows gluten-free recipe, her recipe is probably fine to use. I don't like the Pillsbury flour. I don't say that very often on this channel, but there are certain flours I don't like, but I don't like that brand. Sorry, Pillsbury, come out with something better. Send me some products I can try, but I don't like your gluten-free flour blend. I would recommend trying it with the Bob's Red Mill like I did, King Arthur's Measure for Measure, Cup for Cup. Use one of those blends. Brenda, I think you used Krusty's if I remember correctly. That one I would try. I would start with any of those with your xanthan gum in the mix. Bake time. Bake time is gonna vary just because of our ovens all being just a little different. Start off with the 45-minute bake time if you're doing this in an 8x8. Then I would go 5 to 10 minutes at a time until it's brown enough for you. And if it's not done at that point, a piece of foil and then do 5 to 10 minute increments until it's done. If you go back to that bundt pan, it's gonna be an hour-long bake minimum anyway. Cinnamon. Cinnamon was added to Brenda's recipe as the recipe evolved in her family. Cinnamon is not going to affect your bake. If you like a lot, add a couple teaspoons. If you like a little, add a teaspoon. If you don't like it at all, leave it out. Not going to affect your bake. Nuts. Leave them in or take them out. If you leave them in, I suggest pecans or walnuts, whichever you prefer. My mother would make this with walnuts if she was doing this because she doesn't really like pecans. Apples. Don't listen to those people about use a certain apple. Use an apple that's not going to get mushy. That is my only thought on that. If you like the tartness of Granny Smith, use that. If you like the sweetness of a Fuji or a Honeycrisp, use that. Cup and a half of apples. Chop them small so they have time to cook. You'll be fine. The glaze. The glaze is good. You guys know on a couple videos I've said I'm not a big person with glazes. I'm still not. And in fact, I can't even tell it's on the cake other than it's shiny. But I think it adds to the cake. I like the taste of it. If you're worried about the cake being a little bit dry, that'll take care of it. What do you guys think of this converted recipe? Winner? I think it did really well. I think it was a success. I think I did way too many changes and should not be doing that many changes on a recipe, but whatever. It can't hurt to try, and I tried it, so now you don't have to. Guys, if you have recipes that you want converted, or you have recipes that are good enough for me to share and you love these gluten-free recipes, leave them in the comments below. Drop me an email. If you need my information and can't find my information, let me know. I will reach out to you. This was fun. Brenda, thank you again so much for always watching the videos. I love going back and forth with you in the comments, and I appreciate you subscribing. All the rest of you, thank you for watching as well. Greatly appreciated. And as always, I hope to see you in the next video.